Professor Gita Sen, over a long and distinguished career, you've heard it all, you've seen it all, now it's for you to sum it up all.
And that's a tall order. Thanks, Srinath. Take has said all the usual remarks about being the last speaker, because presumably it literally has all been said. And so I've been racking my brains to think about what it is that I can say that somebody hasn't already alluded to or actually said before. And I thought I would just focus on a couple of things, which really have to do with the practical value of this kind of research for any movement towards UHC. And to direct my remarks towards really addressing two questions: what to focus on and how to focus on it. Now, asking the question what to focus on, I think one of the problems we have in the country is that as health researchers, we've actually had it far too easy. The reason we've had it far too easy is because the health system has been so terrible. And because it's been so terrible, we've had years and years of being able to say, oh, there's not enough funding, there's not enough this, there's not enough that, not ever having to go beyond that level of generalization to sort of how the system works in its nuts and bolts. And then anytime you try to sort of get into that, it was so blatantly easy to say, you know, look at it, you know, the doctors aren't there. And so I think we've had it too easy because the system has been so bad. It's been very easy to target and say, here are all the things that are wrong with the system. What the NRHM did for us is, of course, to complicate that, because it started messing around and trying to actually improve the system in a variety of ways, which then actually posed a number of challenges to us as health researchers. Now, when the last iteration of our attempt to bring knowledge to bear on policies towards UHC, the work of the HLEG, was being done, we had a mandate to cover all of the usual building blocks: financing, human resources, facilities, community management, and so on and so forth. But one of the striking things when we actually started doing our work was how uneven what we know is. There's some things about which we actually know very little in this country. Epidemiology. You know, yesterday we were, as part of this meeting, Sundaraman, whom most people know, said, epidemiological knowledge that we can rely on in this country is actually so weak, except on a couple of things. That we, MMR, IMR, and a couple of other things. And my problem is that, as someone who also spends time with the field project on the ground, that I'm not even sure that our MMR data are at all reliable. And if that is the high point of what we know, then we're in real trouble in terms of what we know. And part of the problem with the MMR data, and if we look at what the NRHM, which obviously was focused very heavily on bringing MMR down, is that there have been some voices that have been saying, yes, MMR has been going down in the country, but can we please look at how much of it is related to demography? Just the fact that, demographic change is taking place in the country is driving it down. Are we seeing bends in the curve? Are we actually seeing a change in the... and if you talk to any health researcher in the field, and by now I've talked to so many of them, all of them say that the numbers of deaths that they are seeing are much higher than anything that's reported. So if we then want to say what is it that we do know about something as big and critical as MMR for the biggest health program that we've had in the country in recent times, the NRHM. We actually may not have good enough knowledge to be able to really look at what's going on. I could say more about the MMR question, but perhaps we can come back to it. So the question that comes from there: how do we actually improve what we do know at a time when we don't have sort of the luxury of 30 years of improving all of the epidemiological research and all of the data and all of everything else? And if we're going to have to move forward, we're going to have to do it in the usual catch-as-catch-can basis. Policy is pushing, responses have to be made, research has to be done, and so on. And I think the critical thing here is really asking the right questions. And quite often as health researchers, the questions we ask and the questions to which policymakers want answers have a large gap between them. And that leads to enormous frustration on both sides, because the health researchers think that the policymakers are just, nitty-gritty nuts and bolts people, and they don't get the bigger picture, and the policymakers are completely frustrated. So don't tell me that the doctors won't go to the rural areas. I know that. I've been an IS officer, from the district level up, and I know that they don't do that. But tell me what I'm supposed to do about it. And I think that we do need to change the way in which we formulate the questions that we look at. Not in general. I'm not making an argument against the larger social science research. But if our research is to be helpful for the movement towards UHC, we actually need to ask that question. Let me give one example. In Karnataka, in northern Karnataka, the same area that Thelma spoke about before, for many, many years we've had exactly this problem. It's the poorest part of Karnataka, and therefore doctors, there's perennial huge vacancies with not just doctors, A&Ms, and everybody else. Well, somebody got the great idea of filling the gaps with Ayush doctors. Terrific. So we've got Ayush doctors in the primary health centers all over the place. The problem here is to then have the health researchers who are close enough with the policymakers to say, hey, have you thought what this might do? And how do we find out what this might do in your system? Because policies for us come with huge assumptions about how people behave. And by people, I mean not just communities, I mean health providers, I mean health managers, I mean policymakers included when these big policies come in. And also huge assumptions about how institutions work or don't work. And this example, what we found in our work, to cut the story short, is that the presence of an Ayush doctor in a primary health center does next to nothing for you in terms of an emergency obstetric facility. It does absolutely nothing because that Ayush doctor in the health center may not even be able to recognize an emergency when it's happening in front of him till it's already much too late. And then, because the incentives in the system are, we don't want any maternal deaths to show up. So then he's, he or she's in a big rush to push the woman out as fast as he has figured out that this is an emergency. And he can't, he doesn't know he or she doesn't know what to do about it. So the incentives in the system, while it's great to have more than a warm body, and I'm not saying an Ayush doctor is just, I have nothing against Ayush doctors, but if they are minimally trained and if they've barely ever done a delivery in their lives, how are they going to handle the first point interface in a system where you're having women coming in and are supposed to use the primary health center as their first point to which the 108 ambulances will now beautifully bring them. Now, but researchers need to be in there. to ask the question, what are the provider competencies that need to be there for these people in order for them to be able to actually do the things that we are expecting them to do. And we're asking too few of those kinds of questions about how incentives and institutions actually work. And that is really my second point, which is how to focus on the kinds of questions and the kinds of research. I think it's extremely important to look at what actions that are taken will do to incentives and will do to the way in which institutions are likely to work. I think, NRHM and institutional delivery, I mean, there's so many stories I can tell from the times when we were talking about the extent to which institutional deliveries were actually going up under NRHM. Of course they are. And I remember at one point being told they're happening in Madhya Pradesh in the sub-centers. And if you look at it, there's been a huge 70-80% increase in institutional deliveries. Nothing at that time was telling me from our work in northern Karnataka that anything could so dramatically have changed about the sub-centers in Madhya Pradesh that they could possibly be handling these institutional deliveries in that way. And very likely, what was probably happening, which is what I heard informally, was that, yes, women were going in for institutional deliveries. They were bypassing the sub-centers altogether. Why would they go there? I mean, those sub-centers are where cow dung chips have been sitting or hay for as long as they can remember. And yes, there may have been some improvements in them. People go straight to the tertiary levels, and the tertiary levels were in fact probably covering and holding most of these increases in institutional deliveries that we were seeing happening. Now, those, what's the data here? Who's supposed to pull this information out? In whose interest is it to know what is actually happening? If you want to be able to claim that your sub-centers now in Madhya Pradesh are working beautifully, you want to not look at the fact of where are these women actually going. But if you actually want to know what you ought to be doing in the system, somebody needs to be in there to start tracking the women and saying, all right, where are the pathways by which women are reaching the system? And what happens to them when they reach the system? And that's what I mean by the fact that we have to take in this health policy and systems research a very strong component of the institutions and incentives. And my last point on that is simply, this then brings us to the importance of the kind of thing that this sort of network is meant to do. Because autonomous research and an interface between that autonomous research of the kind that the NHSRC can provide is extremely important. But the autonomy of that research and the recognition of those incentives as perhaps having an impact in distorting the way we ask questions, the data and information we actually attempt to collect, how we use that really has to be a fundamental part. And therefore, the creation of networks of researchers who are not all embedded within government is critical for the government itself, assuming that there's the political will to really make the MMR come down, which I believe there is. I don't think there's anybody, not one person in this country who would want the MMR to go up. But to really be able to push for that, just as an example, I do think that we need to move more strongly in this direction with the kind of work that this network will do.